Hey everyone, here's Nico Earnshaw from the Decentraland Foundation with another video about creating scenes using the Creator Hub. So in the previous video we talked a bit about smart items, we saw some of the out-of-the-box basic configurations, and we went pretty superficially into some of the settings you can change with these smart items. So there's always some basic configuration that opens up in the default simplified view, and you can change things like what is the hover text and what basic actions some of these smart items can do. For example, in this case of the button, we're determining that when I click the button, this other door will open or close. Now, there's a lot more we can do, and let's dive into that. So all of these smart items have a basic configuration and an advanced configuration. The basic is the default when you just add the item, but if you go up here, you'll see that you can enable the advanced mode. And now we are seeing all of the details about how this is configured. So there's plenty, it's a mouthful, but let's take it one step at a time, and you'll see it's really not all that much. So the first two sections in this UI that you'll see, the first two components are the transform and the GLTF component. These components are really not special to smart items. Every single item in my scene has the very same two components. The transform deals with the position, rotation, and scale of the item, and the GLTF tells me what 3D model to display at that position, rotation, and scale. So this button is no different. It has a transform and a GLTF component, just like every other item in my scene. Now we get to the meat. The action and the trigger component are what really makes the smart item interactive. But let's leave those for the end. So let's quickly deal with the other components that are there as well. So there's a pointer events component. This component has to do with what I see when I point at the button. So in this case, whenever I hover over the button, I can see the text press and a little E key. And this is what I'm seeing here. So the hover text tells me that the text that I'm going to see while I hover over the button says press, and that I activate it with the E key, which is the primary button, and that this is done with a downwards action of the button. I could otherwise use an up action of the button if I want to. And also the maximum distance is how far my avatar can be at the time of pressing on the button, because I could make that a lot further or a lot closer so that the avatar needs to be really up close, for example. Now the last component in this list is the multiplayer component. Now all smart items are multiplayer by default, meaning that whenever a player interacts with a smart item and something about the smart item changes, that change is shared with all of the other players who are there in the scene. And that is thanks to the multiplayer component. Now this has some configurations, we won't go into detail about that, just know that thanks to this component being here, the smart item will behave as a multiplayer part of the experience. So let's go into the really interesting part, so the actions and the triggers. The actions component refers to all of the things that this item can do. Now it doesn't tell you when these things are performed, it just tells you that these things can be done. In this case, the button smart item has two actions. One is a play animation action, has a name and has a type, which is play animation, and this animation has a name because we're fetching an animation that is built into the 3D model and has the name trigger, and the mode for playing that animation is playing once. You could otherwise loop an animation many times. Now each kind of action has a bunch of unique different attributes that refer to that kind of action. In the case of play sound, instead, there are different attributes. There's a path that lets me point to a MP3 file. I can easily replace this if I had, for example, if I navigate the local assets of my scene, inside the fantasy lever folder, for example, I have a sound file which really belongs to the lever, not to the button, but I can drag that in. If I activate the button will actually sound like the lever instead of the button. So I can add as many actions as I want. Let's add a couple of other actions just for the fun of it. So, for example, I can add an animation of type play emote. Let's give it a name. Let's say dance. And I can select out of the list of default emotes, let's select the hammer dance, which is a fun kind of dance. And let's add one more action. And let's make this action of type show text. Let's give this a name and let's call it show text button, and let's write the text surprise exclamation mark. This text will be hidden after 5 seconds. Let's make it really big. Let's make it 200, for example, and this will appear in the middle center. Great, so now this button is capable of making my player dance, and it's capable of showing text in the UI. Now, that doesn't really change how my scene behaves at all. If I press on the button, it still just opens the door as it used to. And that is because these actions exist in the action component, but that doesn't really make them happen until I get a trigger component involved. So in this case, we find that this button's trigger component has one single trigger event, which is onInputAction. This means that it listens to input actions. In this case, it's whenever you press E while pointing at the button. And whenever you press E, this currently does three things. So on this very same button, the black button, we're calling the play active animation and the play sound. These are the two original actions that we had here in our very own actions component. So thanks to this trigger event, the two actions that we saw up there are actually happening on the button. And there's a third action that doesn't belong to the button. We're actually calling the wooden door, and that is how we're opening and closing the door. So this we had configured while we were in the, before entering the advanced mode, in the basic mode. And whatever configurations set in the basic mode live on into the advanced mode. The opposite doesn't happen simply because you can, in the advanced mode, do a lot of things that cannot be represented in the basic mode. But whenever you go from basic to advanced, all of the configurations you set up are preserved and represented in the advanced mode very own way. So let's add more actions, because we just added a couple of actions to our button. Let's make those actually happen. So again, let's call our black button and play the dance action. And let's add one more and also play the show text button action also in the black button. So let's see that in action. So there we go. Now I'm doing 5 things whenever I press that button. I am making my avatar dance, showing the UI text, I'm playing the button's sound and animation, and I am also opening the door. So now a really interesting thing is that these actions that I added to the button, they can be called from outside. In the same way that the button can call, for example, the open and close action from the door, other smart items can call the dance action that we just added to the button. For example, from this lever, remember that this lever was configured to open and close the door. Well, let's just add one more action, and let's call the black button, which is the button we were just editing, and you can see that now I can pick between all of the 4 actions that belong to that button. In this case, I can pick the dance action. So now if I activate the lever, I'm also dancing, and this action is being run by the button, but is being called remotely from the lever. So that's all I wanted to share in this tutorial. I hope that you found this fun and useful, and that it wasn't too hard to follow. And yeah, can't wait to see what you build with this. Thanks and happy building.